When police arrived at the scene of the bloody carnage in a quiet Baltimore suburb, they were confronted with a chilling question scrawled on the wall in red lipstick. Do you regret it now? How could a shy, seemingly unremarkable high school girl turn into a figure capable of orchestrating such devastation? How would you react if someone you trusted had not only betrayed you but also reduced your existence to a cruel joke? What lines would you cross for revenge? The story we are going to look at today is about Tanya James, a brilliant but overlooked teenager whose transformation from victim to perpetrator left an entire community reeling. Her actions weren't random. They were calculated, personal, and born of the deep scars inflicted by those around her. Before we continue, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. The answer, for the surviving students of Eastern Heights High, was obvious. Tanya James, a shy, brilliant 19-year-old senior who had spent most of her high school career flying under the radar, had just shattered the community's sense of safety. But what led this bright young woman, known for her top grades and warm smile, to orchestrate one of the most shocking revenge plots in recent history? And why were her victims, all popular boys, targeted in such a vicious way? Let's rewind to where it all began. Tanya James wasn't the type of girl you'd notice immediately. She wasn't a cheerleader, she didn't attend the big parties, and she certainly wasn't part of the popular crowd. But what she lacked in social capital, she more than made up for in intelligence and ambition. As the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Tanya was determined to rise above her circumstances. Her dream? To become a criminal psychologist. Her peers often overlooked her, until her stunning transformation during senior year. Tanya traded her glasses for contacts, started wearing makeup, and swapped her oversized hoodies for form-fitting clothes. Suddenly, she was no longer invisible. The boys she'd admired from afar began to notice her, and Tanya's social life took a dramatic turn. But what none of them knew was that Tanya had a secret. Over the course of 6 months, she had been systematically seduced, humiliated, and discarded by a group of popular boys in an unspoken game. Led by star athlete Jalen Carter, the group had a cruel tradition: claim a quiet girl, sleep with her, and move on to the next conquest. Tanya had unwittingly become their latest target, but it wasn't just the boys. Some teachers at Eastern Heights High had taken notice of Tanya's transformation and used their authority to take advantage of her vulnerability. Mr. Hargrove, her English teacher, had offered her extra help after school, which quickly turned into inappropriate advances. Similarly, Coach Miller, the revered football coach, had cornered her one day, insinuating that he could help her fix her grades if she was willing to keep their interactions secret. Each incident chipped away at Tanya's sense of self-worth, leaving her feeling isolated and powerless. The boys' group chat was just the final straw. Tanya had endured months of systematic exploitation, with her vulnerability weaponized by those around her. Jalen and his friends had meticulously groomed her, preying on her need for validation and belonging. They showered her with false affection, lured her into compromising situations, and discarded her once they had what they wanted. Jalen, in particular, had used his charm to isolate her, convincing her that their connection was unique, only to laugh about it later with his friends. What made it worse were the teachers who had failed her in even more insidious ways. Mr. Hargrove had initially positioned himself as a mentor, encouraging her academic aspirations, only to exploit her trust by cornering her in his office under the guise of help. He preyed on her insecurities, reminding her how hard it was for students like her, poor, quiet, and overlooked, to succeed. His kind words turned to subtle threats, suggesting her grades might suffer without his continued guidance. Over time, his manipulations became bolder. He began complimenting her appearance, brushing against her arm as he stood too close, and making comments that left her uncomfortable but confused. One day, he took it further, locking his office door and telling her she was special, that she deserved more than what her peers or even her boyfriend could offer. His words, laced with both flattery and coercion, left Tanya frozen in fear. When she finally managed to leave, she carried a weight of shame and anger she couldn't shake. Coach Miller was no better. Under the guise of improving her performance in gym class, he offered to work with her one-on-one. During these sessions, his compliments often turned into veiled propositions. "You know, Tanya," he once said, You're mature for your age. You've got the kind of beauty people notice." His demeanor shifted to threatening when she tried to avoid his advances, implying that her grades could reflect her lack of gratitude. Each betrayal compounded her sense of worthlessness, leaving Tanya trapped in a cycle of manipulation. The toll on her mental health was devastating. Tanya began to withdraw from the world around her, often skipping meals, avoiding friends, and spending long hours locked in her room. The isolation allowed her thoughts to spiral, and she began questioning her own worth. She developed a deep sense of shame, blaming herself for the attention she had received and for falling into the traps laid by her abusers. The anxiety was relentless. Every glance from a peer felt like judgment, and every whisper seemed to echo with mockery. She couldn't sleep without reliving the moments of manipulation and betrayal, and when she did manage to drift off, she was haunted by nightmares of her tormentors laughing at her. The stress began to manifest physically. Tanya suffered from frequent headaches, bouts of nausea, and an overwhelming fatigue that no amount of rest could alleviate. Her grades, once impeccable, began to slip, further fueling her despair. Teachers like Mr. Hargrove, instead of offering support, used her struggles as another means to control her, reinforcing her feelings of helplessness. Tanya's sense of identity was shattered. She had always prided herself on her intelligence and resilience, but now she saw herself as weak, used, and broken. The anger she felt was as much directed inward as it was at her abusers. She would often sit alone, replaying every moment of humiliation in her mind, fixating on what she could have done differently to avoid it all. The once determined girl who dreamed of becoming a criminal psychologist now struggled to envision any future for herself. Her mental health declined to the point where she considered leaving school entirely, convinced she could never escape the shadow of what had been done to her. But in the darkest moments, a spark of defiance began to grow. That anger, that deep, festering rage, became her lifeline. It whispered to her that she didn't have to remain a victim. She could take back control, not just of her life, but of the narrative her abusers had written for her. Tanya's fragile mental state teetered between despair and determination, and it was this precarious balance that would fuel the shocking events to come. Discovering the boy's messages felt like a final confirmation that she had been a pawn in a cruel game. The humiliation ignited a rage she didn't know she possessed. The cruelty she endured wasn't just personal, it was systemic, leaving her determined to make them all pay. Tanya's whirlwind romance with Jalen started innocently enough. He charmed her with his wit, showered her with attention, and made her feel like the most important person in the world. But their relationship had not gone unnoticed by everyone. Mr. Hargrove, her English teacher, who had already crossed boundaries with Tanya under the guise of mentorship, became increasingly jealous. He would frequently comment on how Jalen wasn't good enough for her, masking his envy under the pretense of concern. The betrayal went deeper than Tanya initially realized. Jalen, who had positioned himself as her protector and confidant, had been feeding Mr. Hargrove details of their relationship in exchange for favorable treatment in class. Tanya later discovered that Jalen had shared intimate conversations and moments with Mr. Hargrove as part of a cruel game to amuse himself. To her horror, she realized she had been caught in a web of manipulation that extended far beyond what she imagined. Mr. Hargrove, emboldened by Jalen's cooperation, began inserting himself further into Tanya's life, monitoring her actions and using her vulnerabilities to maintain control. When Tanya once confided in Jalen about a personal struggle, the next day Mr. Hargrove subtly referenced it during class, making her stomach drop. It was clear they had turned her life into a spectacle of mockery and power, leaving Tanya feeling more isolated than ever. As his manipulation deepened, Mr. Hargrove began showing up unexpectedly in places where Tanya was alone, near her locker, in the library, and even outside the cafeteria. Each encounter was cloaked in concern, but his words carried an unmistakable edge. He began reminding her of the favors he'd done for her, such as helping her secure scholarships or easing her workload, only to suggest that these came with expectations. Tanya attempted to draw boundaries, avoiding his office and making excuses to avoid one-on-one meetings, but this only seemed to agitate him further. One afternoon, when Tanya finally mustered the courage to tell him she no longer needed his help, Mr. Hargrove's mask of politeness slipped. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper. "Do you think anyone else is going to help someone like you? Don't be stupid, Tanya. You're better off listening to me." The veiled threat sent shivers down her spine, and she felt cornered in a way she hadn't before. Desperate to regain some sense of control, Tanya reported the encounter to the school counselor. But instead of support, she was met with skepticism. "Are you sure you're not misinterpreting his intentions?" the counselor asked, her tone dismissive. Feeling betrayed yet again, Tanya realized that no one was coming to her aid. Every effort she made to protect herself seemed to backfire, reinforcing Mr. Hargrove's grip on her life. By the time Tanya uncovered Jalen's role in feeding Mr. Hargrove information, her sense of trust was obliterated. She wasn't just being manipulated by one man. She was ensnared in a conspiracy of betrayal, leaving her more determined than ever to take matters into her own hands. For Tanya, the layered deceit was a breaking point. Not only had Jalen betrayed her in the most intimate way, but he had also partnered with a trusted authority figure to humiliate her further. It was a reminder that even the people who appeared to care for her were willing to weaponize her trust, fueling the fire that would ultimately consume them all. The turning point came when Mr. Hargrove intercepted Tanya after class one day, insisting they have a private conversation about her academic performance. Inside his office, he turned the conversation personal, asking inappropriate questions about her relationship with Jalen and insinuating that Jalen couldn't truly appreciate her the way an older, more mature man could. Tanya, uncomfortable but afraid to offend someone in authority, tried to deflect. Hargrove took this as an opening, placing a hand on her shoulder and suggesting she consider spending time with someone who saw her true potential. Feeling trapped, Tanya left the office in tears. She realized that even her teachers, figures who were supposed to guide and protect her, had become complicit in her exploitation. For Tanya, it was another betrayal, one that reinforced her growing resolve to take control of her narrative. And yet, the group chat she would later discover would be the ultimate betrayal, the final push that turned her quiet fury into action. One fateful afternoon, Tanya borrowed Jalen's phone to look up a restaurant. What she found instead was a thread of vile messages between Jalen and his friends, Kendrick, Devin, and Marcus, boasting about their sexual encounters with her. They referred to her as just another trophy and joked about her naivety. Her world crumbled. What would you do if you found out the people you trusted had been playing you for sport? Would you cry, confront them, or would you plot revenge? Tanya chose the latter. For weeks, Tanya meticulously crafted her plan. She studied each boy's habits, their vulnerabilities, and their darkest secrets. Her ultimate goal wasn't just to humiliate them, it was to make them fear her. First, she planted seeds of paranoia. Anonymous messages began arriving on their phones, cryptic notes that hinted at their crimes. "I know what you did. Karma's coming." Then, she began to manipulate them. She anonymously tipped off Kendrick's girlfriend about his infidelity, setting off a messy breakup. She sent a forged letter to the principal claiming that Marcus had been stealing from the football fund, which led to his suspension. Slowly but surely, Tanya's tormentors, once untouchable, were unraveling. But the final act of her revenge would be far more sinister. On the night of May 27th, Eastern Heights High's graduating class gathered for one last blowout party at an abandoned warehouse. The event was unsanctioned, unsupervised, and, for Tanya, the perfect stage. Dressed in a red silk dress that clung to her figure, Tanya made a grand entrance. Heads turned as she walked in, her aura exuding confidence and danger. Jalen and his friends, uneasy but trying to save face, watched her closely. What none of them realized was that Tanya was harboring a dangerous secret. Months earlier, she had contracted an STI from one of her abusers, a grim souvenir of the betrayal she endured. The diagnosis had come as a shock, compounding her feelings of humiliation and shame. She told no one, instead internalizing the pain as yet another consequence of the violations she had suffered. Fueled by her rage and the knowledge that they had irrevocably altered her life, Tanya made a chilling decision. Over the weeks leading up to the party, she methodically arranged encounters with each of the individuals who had wronged her. These weren't impulsive acts. Each one was deliberately planned to ensure her tormentors remained oblivious to her deeper intentions. With Jalen, she used his arrogance against him, feeding his ego by pretending to forgive him and rekindling their brief romance. He was eager to believe her, convinced that his charm had worked its magic again. For Kendrick, she appealed to his vulnerability, fabricating a story about needing comfort and subtly manipulating him into thinking he was the one in control. Marcus was lured in through sheer temptation, his own hubris blinding him to the fact that Tanya had been setting the stage for weeks. Even Mr. Hargrove, who prided himself on his cunning, fell for Tanya's act. She orchestrated a scenario where she appeared to be seeking academic help late one evening, knowing he would take the bait. When he did, Tanya maintained a facade of submission, making him believe he still had power over her. All the while, she ensured that each encounter served her ultimate purpose, an unspoken punishment for their actions. None of them suspected her true motives or the danger they were exposing themselves to. Tanya's calculated demeanor masked a storm brewing within her, allowing her to remain in control while setting the stage for the reckoning she had meticulously planned. By the time they realized the depth of her vengeance, it would be far too late to escape its consequences. Tanya's calm demeanor and calculated approach allowed her to carry out her plan without raising suspicion. As she moved through the crowd that night, her confidence wasn't just a performance. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her revenge was already in motion, woven into the very fabric of their lives. By the time the night unfolded into chaos, Tanya's dark secret would ensure that her tormentors carried her mark long after the evening ended. As the night wore on, Tanya put her plan into motion. She spiked their drinks with a mild sedative, ensuring they'd be disoriented but conscious. One by one, she lured them into a back room under the guise of wanting to talk. Inside, she revealed her true intentions. What followed was a twisted game of psychological warfare. Tanya forced them to confess their sins while recording the entire ordeal. She made them write letters of apology to her and to the other girls they had victimized. She even brought out a series of props, symbols of their deceit, to drive her points home. Jalen, shaking with anger, was made to hold the very phone that had housed the incriminating group chat. Kendrick sobbed as Tanya read aloud a love letter he had once written to another victim, exposing the hollow nature of his charm. Marcus, in a state of complete breakdown, begged for forgiveness, only for Tanya to coolly ask if he'd given such mercy to any of his targets. The more they resisted, the darker her tactics became. She controlled every detail of the scene, from the lighting that cast eerie shadows to the ominous music playing faintly in the background. Tanya's psychological game was not only revenge but a performance, an unforgettable lesson in pain and regret. But Tanya underestimated how far desperation could push someone. When Jalen attempted to overpower her, chaos erupted. By the time the police arrived, the scene was one of absolute horror. Broken glass, bloodstains, and 3 unconscious boys. Tanya was arrested on the spot, but her story didn't end there. During her trial, the community was split. Some viewed her as a victim who had been driven to the brink, while others saw her as a cold-blooded vigilante. Her defense argued that she had suffered psychological abuse at the hands of her tormentors, likening her actions to a cry for justice. Meanwhile, the boys, though physically unharmed, faced public shame as Tanya's recordings went viral. Their lives were forever changed, as were the lives of their families. But what about Tanya? Was she a victim of cruel manipulation or the architect of her own downfall? And more importantly, what would you have done in her shoes? Thank you for joining us on this gripping journey into the story of Tanya James. If you're captivated by stories like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode packed with twists and moral dilemmas. What do you think about Tanya's actions? Was she justified in seeking revenge? Or did she go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can weigh in too. See you next time for another jaw-dropping tale.